My hearing isn't too good. Sometimes I have trouble understanding questions. Here I'm facing a different problem. I have to understand the handwriting.
Harder, I think.
No, it's not too bad. There's a question here about my graph on battle deaths. Does it include all violent conflict deaths? No. Does it include civilians? Yes. The graph is for all battle deaths, military and civilian, but deaths resulting directly from organized action in wartime, and not indirect deaths, not dying 5 years later from injuries you received in the war, not dying from disease, which was not prevented because somebody bombed the hospital. Then the next part of the question is what about the Rwanda genocide in 1994? That is not included in the figures that I presented here, because these are figures. The conflict is defined. Armed conflict is defined as armed action between two organized parties, at least one of which is a government. So if there are two governments involved, it's an interstate conflict. If there's one government against a rebel movement, it's a civil war or internal armed conflict. Now, if you want to look at genocide, massacres, in other words, a conflict between the government and unorganized civilians, you have to look to a different set of statistics. And it's quite true that in the case of Rwanda in 1994, there were more people killed in one-sided violence in Rwanda than the total number of battle deaths for the entire world. And some people have argued, the American political scientist Rudolf Rummel in particular has argued that more people are killed by government, primarily by their own government, than are killed in war. Rummel says between 4 and 5 times as more in the 20th century. But Rummel has a relatively wide concept of one-sided violence, something he called democide, which includes death by starvation from mistaken government policies. And this was a big killer in China during the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 61, where they tried to force industrialization, force farmers to turn in their plows to have them melted into iron and so on. This led to starvation, and even though the government got reports of starvation, it didn't reverse the policy. Historians are now debating whether this caused 20 million deaths or 30 million deaths. And of course, that's much higher than the number of people killed in war during the same period. So then the question is, what is the trend in one-sided violence? I didn't talk about that, but I would argue that it's the same thing. That the trend in one-sided violence is very much dependent on individual episodes. I mean, things like the genocide, Stalin's policy, Mao's policy, and more recently Rwanda, of course Cambodia. But if you add all these up, you look at a trend over time, it's probably a jagged trend like this, but declining. Finally, one more thing that's not included, that's non-state violence, which I briefly mentioned. Violence between two groups where the government is not involved as a party. Generally, that type of violence tends to be much, much lower. I don't know if there is a clear trend. It might be up or it might be down, but it's very, very much lower than the two other types of violence. Well, I spent a lot of time on one question, but...
Oh, that's perfect. You have 1 minute left if you...
Okay. Could I comment on the issue of taking temperature as the only indicator for climate change war assessment? Ted Miguel, who was one of the authors of the article that I cited on temperature and conflict, he is actually better known as, among economists, is known as the Rain Man, because he published an important article in 2004 where he looked at rainfall deviations and conflicts and found that with negative deviations in rainfall in sub-Saharan Africa, where agriculture is very much dependent on rainfall, that tends to lead to more conflicts. Now there's some problems with that study too, because he forgot, he used our conflict data, but he forgot to take out countries that are involved in war in the neighboring country. And if you think about it, is there any reason why there should be more conflict in country A because there's less rainfall in country B, into which country A has intervened? Not really. So those countries should have been taken out of the study. And there's another article which corrects for that and finds that the results still hold, but they're much weaker. And again, this is not a conspiracy. This is not dishonesty. This is a normal part of science, that people sometimes make mistakes, or they make questionable judgment or debatable coding decisions. Other people do it differently. You go back and forth, and eventually some kind of consensus emerges. But I would definitely say that both rainfall and temperature and natural disasters, all of those are relevant indicators of climate change that need to be taken into account in a proper study of climate change and conflict. The reason why Miguel and his colleagues shifted to temperature in the more recent article, even though they've been using rainfall before, was that they said that the climate change predictions for changes in precipitation in Africa were too poor to yield good forecasts. And that's generally a problem in the climate change debate, that where good data are most needed, they're the worst. So you can get an accurate prediction of what's going to happen to rainfall in Spain or in southern US. But of course the chances that rainfall deviations will lead to armed conflict in those areas is very low for other reasons. But you don't get as good data where there might be a better chance that it might lead to conflict. Somebody asked about violence have you taken into account growing social and political resistance to refugees and migrants? Will this be a major impact of climate change? Yeah, I think that's quite possible. With increasing migration, in particular where it cuts across cultural, linguistic, and religious lines, there may be increasing resistance, and there may be riots and possibly violence, as we've seen in France and in many cities in Western Europe. How much there will be of it, whether this will be enough to sort of seriously threaten the stability of established democracies and so on, that's a wholly different issue, and that I'm much more doubtful about. But this is something we're also trying to move the study of climate change and conflict a little bit in that direction. One paper that I heard the other day from one of my PhD students is this is somebody who's looked at natural disasters and Hindu-Muslim riots in India. You might think that natural disasters increases the scarcity problems, where you take it out on the people you don't like, who might also be migrants. And of course, there's no lack of Hindu-Muslim riots in India. There are lots of them. But what he found was that he couldn't actually find any relationship between the natural hazards and the. Again, this is not yet been published, and it's a line of inquiry that's just in its infancy, but it's certainly worth looking at.